We're going to begin with the case against former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin for the death of George Floyd, now in the hands of a sequestered jury. The panel of 6 white and 6 black or multiracial jurors began deliberating at 4 o'clock Central Time yesterday and ended the day without a verdict following hours of closing and rebuttal arguments.
What the defendant did to George Floyd killed him. Make no mistake, this is not a prosecution of the police. It is a prosecution of the defendant. And there's nothing worse for good police than a bad police who doesn't follow the rules, who doesn't follow procedure, who doesn't follow training. He called out to George Floyd. He said, you can't win. You can't win. And George Floyd replied, I'm not trying to win. I'm not trying to win. I'm scared. But the defendant was trying to win. He wasn't going to be told what to do. He wasn't going to take a challenge to his authority. He was trying to win. And George Floyd paid for it with his life.
I submit to you that the state has failed to meet its burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. You have to be convinced that the defendant's actions caused the death of Mr. Floyd. Actions that happened before Mr. Floyd was arrested that had nothing to do with Officer Chauvin's activities are not the natural consequences of the defendant's actions. Were there other contributing factors that were not the natural result of Mr. Chauvin's acts? The drug ingestion, right? The bad heart, the diseased heart, the hypertension. All of these things existed before Mr. Chauvin arrived.
You were told, for example, that Mr. Floyd died because his heart was too big. You heard that testimony. And now, having seen all the evidence, having heard all the evidence, you know the truth. And the truth of the matter is that the reason George Floyd is dead is because Mr. Chauvin's heart was too small.
Wow.
Willie, again, you never know what's going to happen when the juries go in and begin deliberating. Never for people that have been through that process. Many come out of the jury room and that experience a bit shaken at times by all that's taken in there, all the prejudices, all the assumptions with no basis in law. That is, though, the system. If you have a jury of 12 people, that may happen. All that said, yesterday seemed to be as straightforward as this entire case has been. It was the defense was scrambling, trying to blame everybody and everything, and even the judge at the end, when he gave him jury instructions, said basically, Mr. Chauvin, he owned what happened to this person, regardless of how he found him. The fact that the other causes contributed to his death does not relieve the defendant of criminal liability, which is a very important jury instruction.
It is, for sure. And what we heard from the defense yesterday was what we've heard throughout this trial, which was these sort of ancillary factors, talking about carbon monoxide poisoning. That was shot down by an expert, talking about the drugs in Mr. Floyd's system, talking about the crowd that surrounded the officer and George Floyd as being threatening somehow. The prosecution came out and said, here's a picture of the crowd. You tell me if you think this group of people is threatening or if they're concerned that a man is being killed. And we heard what's unique about this case, guys, is that we've all seen what happened. We've seen it again and again and again. The world has seen what happened. And so at the end of the day, the prosecution asked the jury to believe its eyes. You've seen the video. Believe your eyes, said Jerry Blackwell, the prosecutor there. Let's bring into our conversation civil rights attorney, former Brooklyn, New York prosecutor Charles Coleman, and MSNBC legal analyst and a defense attorney, Danny Savalos. Good morning to you both. Charles, let me begin with you and what you saw in that courtroom yesterday. Do you feel that the prosecution did everything it needed to do? Obviously, you don't know what kind of doubt is in the mind of a juror, but did the prosecution make its case?
Good morning, Willie. I think that the prosecution absolutely did. As I expected, they led with a theme around common sense, trusting your eyes, sort of referring to what the juries have already seen in terms of the video and all of the evidence that has been laid out in front of them. Of course, they spoke to all of the technical elements necessary in order to satisfy each piece of what the charges actually entail. But at the end of the day, I think you're absolutely correct, and Joe as well, in terms of the fact that they made it very, very clear, very, very straightforward, and very, very simple for the jury in terms of making a decision. And as a prosecutor, that's exactly what you want to do. You want to make it as clear and straightforward and simple for the jury as possible. I thought that they did some brilliant things in terms of their themes. They humanized George Floyd, which was something that I expected. But as you saw in the lead-in clip to the segment, one of the other things that they did was that they isolated Derek Chauvin. They isolated him as a police officer instead of it being a thing where the whole police department is on trial, where if there are people on the jury who are sympathetic to police, that they might have a problem convicting Derek Chauvin. What they did in that moment was that they separated Derek Chauvin from police and basically said, listen, police are not on trial. Derek Chauvin is not, in this case, representative of police. And because of that, we don't want you to basically make that association in a way that might be challenging for some of the jurors. So in isolating him in that way and humanizing George Floyd, it again allowed there to be very emotional, very feeling-based summation and argument that surrounded the technical evidence that they had already put in front of the jury about the elements of each crime.
Danny, it was interesting. We heard from the prosecutors yesterday reminding the jurors this is not an anti-police prosecution. This actually is a pro-police prosecution because they argued an officer like Derek Chauvin makes all police look bad. How do you think that plays into it when they talk about the role of police more broadly in the country to a jury, if you have a sympathetic juror to police, for example?
This is a very good strategy by the prosecution. Don't put the entire police department on trial. Isolate one of them and say, look, this was a rogue actor. Generally, we're not trying the police department of Minneapolis. We're not trying police throughout the country. We're not trying law enforcement. Just focus on what this rogue officer did, and then you will not shoulder the additional burden of looking at whether or not law enforcement in the country needs to change or something like that. That's not the issue here, and the prosecution wisely stayed away from that. And the other reason they stayed away from it is self-preservation. They work hand in hand with this police department. They surely don't want to put them on trial for this case and then create a rift in future cases.
Danny, I'm curious what you thought of the amount of video that was played by the defense, almost trying to sort of change the perception that the video, which is engraved in so many people's minds, so traumatizing, but also video of the crowds and painting the crowds as this sort of dangerous throng when there'd be like two people on a corner saying, can you stop killing that guy? I mean, sometimes it just didn't match up to what they were saying, it appeared.
I have to wonder if the prosecution team, on a break, the break that the judge imposed midway through the defense closing, got into their side room, looked at each other and said, did he just play our own video? They must have been thrilled because that could only have helped the prosecution. Although I'm not second guessing the defense. They must have needed some evidence in that video that they needed to get before the jury. And you notice they only picked video, or mostly picked video, that didn't show Derek Chauvin's knee on the back of George Floyd's neck. But video has audio, and you could hear in the background George Floyd pleading for his life. You could hear bystanders showing their concern. So that was a decision that carried a lot of risk, but the defense must have felt it was warranted given the circumstances.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.